Welcome to my story where I cram my crazy memories into a few minutes. Have a good listen. From the outside, my life seemed perfect. A big, beautiful house and a cute dog. I had it all. At least that's what everyone thought. I'm Eva, I'm 26 years old, and on paper, I was living a dream. Daniel and I had been married for 4 years. We had settled into our routines and built our life together. Our house was always spotlessly clean, with a manicured lawn and cheerful flowers blooming in the garden. We had dinner parties where our friends commented on how tidy we looked, but there was no joy anymore. Our environment was slowly becoming quiet, and I was getting lonely. Daniel's behavior slowly changed. The man who used to run home to see me now seemed to find any excuse to linger at work. Our dinners, once filled with laughter and shared stories, now consisted only of us eating without talking, as if we were separated. My wife's job at the law firm was increasingly consuming her time and energy. Midnight calls and urgent emails became the norm. I understood the pressures of his career, but I couldn't understand why I no longer seemed to be in his life. The passion that had characterized the first years of our relationship was gone, replaced by a polite distance that felt incredibly expansive. I found myself wondering what had caused this change. Was it just the natural progression of a relationship, and the initial excitement was no longer there? Or was there something deeper, a fundamental change in how we saw each other? I was finding it very difficult to find answers to these questions in my mind. Now this silence has become habitual, and I wanted something different because I know that if I am exposed to this loneliness any longer, I will go crazy. But in the midst of this growing life, there was one constant source of solace in my life: our dog Max. We adopted him as a puppy shortly after we moved into our home, and he quickly became an integral part of our lives. As Daniel grew distant, I found myself turning to Max for the affection and companionship I longed for. His wagging tail and eager eyes greeted me every day, offering unconditional love in stark contrast to the coldness I felt from Daniel. Little did I know that Max would become more than just a pet. As my relationship with Daniel continued to deteriorate, Max would become my confidant, my solace, and ultimately a guide for change in my life. But that's a story for another time. In the early days of our relationship, Daniel and I couldn't keep our hands off each other. Every moment we spent together was pleasurable and exciting, filled with passionate kisses, prolonged caresses, and an insatiable desire for intimacy. We spent lazy Sunday mornings tangled in the sheets, with gentle touches and whispered affection. Even the simplest gestures, holding hands as we walked down the street, or a quick hug before work, felt charged with love and intimacy. You were so interested in each other, and we were both so in love, a real love and affection. But as the years passed, this physical connection began to fade. Passionate nights became less frequent, replaced by quiet evenings when Daniel and I occupied the same space, but without any real connection. Our bed, once a sanctuary of intimacy, became a cold and lonely place. I found myself lying awake at night. The intimacies between us increased, and I didn't enjoy fucking anything anymore. I immediately set to work to make it all happen again with Daniel. One evening, I wore the dress Daniel had always loved, the one he said brought out the color in my eyes. It consisted of a very expensive miniskirt and pantyhose that I thought he would love and be impressed by. I prepared his favorite dinner and set the table with candles, hoping to create a romantic atmosphere. But when Daniel came home, he barely looked at me before retreating to his office and muttering about the deadline. Another time, sitting at his desk, I gently placed my hand on his shoulder and offered him a light massage to ease his tension. Daniel stiffened at my touch and shrugged me off, saying, "Not now, Eva. I'm busy." I still don't understand why the closer I got to him, the more he rejected me. The most painful moment came on a rare night when we went to bed at the same time. Gathering my courage, I reached out to touch Daniel's arm, hoping to initiate some kind of intimacy. He flinched away and turned his back to me, murmuring, "I'm tired, Eva. Let's go to sleep." I lay there in the darkness, tears silently running down my face, feeling completely alone, even though my husband was inches away from me. These rejections damaged my self-esteem. I found myself constantly questioning my attractiveness, wondering if I had somehow become unattractive to the man who once couldn't get enough of me. Was I no longer attractive? Had I done something wrong? What could I have done? I think it was all his fault. I didn't do anything. As the physical distance between us grew, our feelings for each other diminished. Our conversations became superficial, our interactions mechanical. I began to feel like a ghost in my own home, drifting from room to room, not seen or felt by the person who was supposed to be my partner. I wanted physical intimacy, but I was tired of asking for it and tired of trying to convince Danielle. In this emotional desert, I found myself longing for any form of connection, any scrap of love. And in this wasteland, I discovered an unexpected oasis of comfort, an animal with 4 legs and a wagging tail. Let me remind you again, the name Max has been a part of our lives since he was a puppy. Shortly after we moved into our house, we adopted him, dreaming of the perfect family pet. In the beginning, he was an adorable companion who greeted us at the door and curled up at our feet on movie nights. Daniel and I took turns walking him and laughing as he chased squirrels in the park. Max was the finishing touch to our perfect life. Our walks, once a shared activity with Daniel, have become my dreams. When I entered the room, my husband barely looked up from his laptop, Max's tail wagging furiously, his whole body trembling with happiness at my mere presence. When I spoke, when I shared my thoughts and fears, Max listened intently, tilting his head as if he understood every word. The thought that he was cheating on me never left my mind, but whatever. Physical affection, so lacking in my marriage, was abundant in my relationship with Max. Burying my face in his soft fur and relaxing into the steady rhythm of his heartbeat, his warmth next to me on the couch filled the void left by Daniel's distance. The simple act of loving Max brought a sense of peace that was foreign to my human relationships. As the bond between Max and I deepened, I couldn't help but wonder how it would affect my already strained marriage. Would Daniel notice the growing bond between Max and me? Would he be jealous or relieved that I had found a source of solace? I kept telling myself that it didn't matter to me. He doesn't care about me, and I won't care about him. One quiet Sunday evening, I realized that Daniel had already gone to the office, and I was curled up in bed with Max. As I stroked his fur, feeling the warmth of his body against mine, I had a startling realization. I craved Max's presence more than my husband's. The unconditional love and affection I received from my dog had become more satisfying than the cold distance of my marriage. But as I lay there, one question haunted me. Could the companionship of a dog, no matter how loyal and loving, really replace the human bond? I really didn't know, and we will see in the future. In the meantime, if you like the video, I will share more of my stories, so let's move on. Just when I thought I had lost all hope, Daniel surprised me one evening. He came home early from work, something that hadn't happened for months. As I was preparing dinner, he approached me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Eva," he said, his voice hesitant, "I think we've grown apart and we need to keep things good." My heart leapt with excitement. Was this the moment I had been waiting for? A chance to reconnect, to bridge the growing gap between us. I felt a fragile but persistent wave of hope. Maybe, just maybe, Daniel had finally realized the distance between us and wanted to make things right. We sat down at the dining table, dinner forgotten. Daniel reached out and took my hand, a gesture that had once seemed natural but now seemed oddly formal. "I know things haven't been great between us lately," he began, his words careful and measured. "I want to make it right." When he spoke, I noticed that there was something strange in his tone, as if he was speaking fake words that lacked reality and sincerity. Instead, it sounded like he was giving a prepared speech to a client instead of talking to his wife. Still, I clung to the hope that this could be a turning point. Daniel's attempt to reconnect was painfully awkward. He suggested we try to be more intimate, but his words sounded clinical, devoid of any real desire. When he leaned in to kiss me, it was tasteless, like an obligatory duty rather than a genuine expression of affection. As his hands caressed my whole body, I realized that I still didn't feel the same excitement and pleasure as before. As I fumbled through this forced intimacy, my mind went blank. Was this really what our relationship had come to? The realization hit me like a physical blow. This was not a step toward healing our marriage. It was a clear revelation of how broken our marriage really was. As Daniel walked away, looking almost relieved that the ordeal was over, I felt a wave of sadness wash over me. There was a fundamental disconnect at the core of our relationship that could not be bridged by a single conversation or a forced attempt at rapprochement. When Daniel retreated to his home office, muttering something about an early meeting the next day, I was left alone with my thoughts. The hope I had briefly harbored had dissipated, replaced by a cold certainty. Our marriage was broken, perhaps beyond repair. In the days that followed, as the awkwardness of this failed reconnection attempt continued, I found myself turning more and more to Max. His unconditional love and genuine affection were in stark contrast to the empty gestures of my marriage. Little did I know that this growing bond would soon bring my relationship with Daniel to the breaking point. In the silence of our failed marriage, I found solace in an unexpected source. Yet as the bond between Max and me grew stronger, Daniel's resentment grew. I wondered if it was fair to say he was jealous of me. At home, I began to prioritize Max's needs over Daniel's. I rushed to feed Max before asking Daniel about dinner. When choosing a movie for the evening, I preferred something I could watch with Max curled up next to me rather than the action movies Daniel preferred. These small decisions, which on their own seemed insignificant, began to add up. For example, when I came home from work, Max was playing games in front of the door, and when my wife saw this, she would yell at Max to stop it. "You stupid fucking dog." And sometimes I would get angry and yell at Daniel, and it became more and more serious. One evening, the tension finally boiled over. I canceled dinner plans with Daniel to take Max to the vet for a checkup. When I got home, Daniel was waiting, his face dark with anger. "You have to stop this, Eva," he snapped. "You're more interested in that dog than in me. It's not normal." "Oh, man, like you were so interested in me." His words hurt me, but they also lit a fire of defense in me. "Isn't that normal?" I shot back. "What about you, Daniel? Is it normal to turn your back on your wife every night? Is it normal to treat me like I'm invisible? I work for a living, you just spend time with a dog. Max shows me care and affection that you don't," I said, my voice shaking. "He's there for me when you're not. Is it so surprising that I'm with him all the time?" Our argument escalated, years of unspoken resentment spilling out. Daniel accused me of neglecting our marriage, and I told him that he had left a long time ago. All the while Max sat nearby, softly whining at our raised voices. As our shouting reached its peak, I made a statement that irreparably widened the gulf between us. "At least Max loves me unconditionally. That's more than I can say for you." Then we were silent for a long time. Daniel looked at me, a mixture of pain and anger in his eyes. Without saying anything, he stomped out of my room. After a confrontation, I collapsed on the floor, emotionally exhausted. Max snuggled up next to me and put his head in my lap, trying to comfort me. As I stroked his fur, I realized that we had reached a breaking point. The gulf between Daniel and I had grown too great to ignore, and the bond between Max and me had become a catalyst to confront the harsh realities of our failed marriage. For weeks, the tension between Daniel and me had been building like a pressure cooker ready to explode. Our argument about Max had opened a floodgate of resentment and unspoken grievances. There was a lot of anger in our house. Daniel's mood fluctuated between cold silence and barely contained anger. The dog glared at Max every time he approached me, his jaw visibly clenched. I found myself constantly on edge, preparing for the next outburst. It happened on a stormy evening. Max and I had just returned from a walk, our shoes muddy from the rain, soaked roads. Daniel was waiting in the living room, his posture rigid with anger. "That's enough," he snapped, rising from his chair. "I'm sick of this dog obsession." Before I could react, Daniel walked past me, grabbed Max by the collar and dragged him towards the back door. Max groaned, confused and scared of the rough treatment. "Daniel, stop!" I shouted, but my protests were ignored. With a mighty shove, Daniel pushed Max into the rain-soaked garden. The sound of the door slamming shut echoed through the house, followed by Max's plaintive bark. "He's staying out tonight," Daniel said, his voice cold and firm. "Maybe then you will remember who your husband is." I wondered if he was telling the truth. I stood there in shocked silence. The brutality of Daniel's action hit me like a physical blow. Through the window I could see Max huddled under a bush, his fur already wet from the relentless rain. The atmosphere in the house was stifling. Daniel retreated to the study, leaving me alone with Max's occasional moans from outside. I paced the living room, torn between my fear of confronting Daniel and my overwhelming need to comfort Max. As the night wore on, my resolve grew stronger. I couldn't leave Max outside alone and scared, but I also knew that bringing him back inside would be a direct challenge to Daniel's authority and potentially shatter what little was left of our marriage. I waited until the house was quiet, Daniel's snores coming from our bedroom. With trembling hands, I unlocked the back door and stepped out into the moonlit garden. Max emerged from his makeshift shelter, his tail wagging weakly. As I knelt beside him and stroked his damp fur, I felt a wave of emotion wash over me. In that moment, my choice became very clear. I couldn't go back inside, I couldn't leave Max alone again. Instead, I settled on the damp grass, pulling Max to me. As we snuggled together in the moonlight, I realized I'd made my decision. The warmth of Max's body felt more like home than the cold house behind me. In choosing to stay with Max, I was choosing myself my need for unconditional love and true connection. When the first rays of dawn appeared on the horizon, I knew that nothing would ever be the same again. I didn't know what would happen in the future, but after a few years I really felt hope in my life. Lying in my bed, as the first rays of sunlight filtered through the curtains, I found myself wide awake, my mind racing. The events of the previous night played over and over in my head: Daniel's anger, Max's moans, and my silent vigil in the garden. The warmth of the bed felt stifling, a stark contrast to the damp grass where I found unexpected solace. I looked at Daniel as he slept next to me, his back turned and the emotional connection between us completely gone. I cried, remembering our old days, his face relaxed in sleep, free of the perpetual frown that had become his default expression. For a moment, I caught a glimpse of the man I had fallen in love with all those years ago, but the image quickly faded, replaced by memories of cold silences and unspoken resentments. Unable to bear the silence any longer, I got out of bed, my bare feet barely making a sound on the cool parquet floor. I stood in the bedroom doorway, half expecting Daniel to stir to ask where I was going, but he remained motionless, lost in his own reverie or maybe in his nightmares. The journey to the back door was like walking through molasses, the weight of my impending decision weighing on me with every step. As I turned the handle, part of me wondered if I had crossed a line that could never be crossed. But the thought of Max alone and confused pushed me forward. The garden was bathed in the soft glow of the early morning light. The dew clung to every blade of grass, forming a shimmering carpet leading to Max's kennel. As I approached, I saw his ears pricked up, his tail wagging before it had fully emerged. Max ran towards me, his earlier fear forgotten in the joy of reunion. I knelt down, wrapped my arms around his damp fur, and inhaled his familiar scent. In that moment, the rightness of my choice sank in. This was unconditional love, pure and simple. As I sat with Max, stroking his head and murmuring soft words of comfort, I felt a peace that hadn't been in my life for a long time. It felt like I was an actor in a movie, and we were filming a love scene. Yet, even as I savored this moment of connection, I couldn't ignore the nagging voice in the back of my mind. What did this mean for my marriage? Would Daniel and I be able to bridge the growing gap between us? Or had this night in the garden sealed our fate? As the sun rose, I made a silent vow. I would choose emotional fulfillment, even if it meant leaving the comfort of my marriage behind. The road ahead was uncertain, full of challenges I could not even imagine. But with Max by my side, I felt ready to face whatever lay ahead. The house felt different when I stepped inside, the air heavy with unspoken tension. I moved quietly through the kitchen, turning on the coffee machine more out of habit than desire. The mundane task of measuring the grounds and filling the water reservoir felt surreal after the emotional turmoil of the night. Daniel's footsteps on the stairs made my heart race. I steeled myself, not sure what to expect. When he entered the kitchen, his face was a cold mask of indifference. Our eyes met briefly, then he looked away and reached for a cup without a word. The silence between us was deafening. I wanted to talk, to explain, to soothe our loneliness that had grown overnight, but the words stuck in my throat, and I recoiled in a mixture of guilt and defiance. Daniel poured his coffee and leaned against the counter, his body leaning away from me. The physical distance reflected the distance between us. I watched him, noting the tension in his jaw, the whitening of his knuckles as he gripped his cup. "I have an early meeting at 9:30, he finally said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. It was not a real explanation, just a statement to fill the oppressive silence. I shook my head, not trusting my voice. Part of me wanted to confess, to tell him about the night I spent with Max in garden, but another part of me, growing stronger by the minute, knew that such a confession would only deepen the rift between us. When Daniel finished his coffee and moved to leave, I felt desperate. "Daniel," I began, my voice barely above a whisper. He paused, his back to me, waiting. But in that moment, I realized that there was nothing I could say that would fix this. He left without another word. The sound of the front door closing was like the final punctuation mark of our failed attempt at normalization. I collapsed into a chair, This incident had worn me out. Who could be right? Throughout the day, I wandered around the house like a ghost, going through my usual routine, but everything felt different now. In every room, there were memories of happier times, but now we realized how far apart we had become. As evening approached, I found myself standing by the back door looking at Max's kennel, a sight that gave me a mixture of comfort and conflict. I knew Daniel would be home soon and we would have to face each other again, but how could we move forward if we couldn't talk about what had happened? With each hour that passed, an awareness began to take shape in my mind. The silence that characterized today was not just about last night. It was the culmination of years of separation, unmet needs, and unspoken resentments. As the sun began to set and cast long shadows across the garden, I realized that this silence spoke volumes about the true state of our relationship. And in that moment, I knew that the hardest conversation was yet to come, not with Daniel, but with myself. The silence of the house enveloped me as I sat on the edge of our bed, my eyes fixed on the framed photo of Daniel and me on our wedding day. We looked so happy and full of hope for the future. I tried to remember the feeling, but it all went away like water, and all that was left was me and my memories. In contrast to these fading memories were the vivid, present moments with Max, his unwavering loyalty, the comfort of his presence on sleepless nights, the joy in his eyes when we played in the park. With Max, I felt seen, appreciated, and loved unconditionally, and the realization of this hit me like a punch in the gut. I was finding more emotional fulfillment in my relationship with my dog than with my husband. My mind was trying to pinpoint when things changed between Daniel and me. Was it a gradual change or a sudden rupture? I thought about the growing silence at dinner, the increasing distance in our bed, the way we moved around each other like strangers sharing a space. Each small moment of disconnection had built up over time, creating an impenetrable wall between us. I stood up and paced the room, struggling with my emotions, guilt fighting with a sense of liberation. I was ashamed that I had found more comfort in Max's company than in my marriage, but I couldn't deny the reality of it. With Max, I could be myself without fear of judgment or rejection. When was the last time I felt like this with Daniel? As this realization solidified, I felt a mixture of sadness and relief. Our marriage, the life we had built together, could be irreparable. The thought was terrifying but strangely liberating. Instead of accepting what our relationship had become, I clung to the idea of how it should have been. I walked to the window and looked out at the garden where I had spent the night with Max. The memory of that moment, choosing comfort and true connection over social expectations, felt like a turning point. It was then that I realized I couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine. Now the question was, what next? The thought of confronting Daniel with these truths made me sick to my stomach. How could I explain that our dog was showing me what was missing in our marriage? This conversation seemed impossible, but it was becoming more and more necessary. When I heard Daniel's car pull into the driveway, I steeled myself. Admitting the truth to myself was only the first step. The real challenge was deciding what to do with this newfound clarity and finding the courage to act accordingly. The sound of Daniel's key in the lock sent a jolt through me. I stood in the living room, my heart pounding as I waited for him to come in. When he appeared in the doorway, our eyes met, and I saw that he was momentarily surprised to find me there. "Daniel," I said, my voice more determined than I felt, "we need to talk." He paused, then nodded slowly and put the briefcase down. We both sat at either end of the sofa. There was a great tension in the atmosphere, the distance between us evoking our feelings. I thought a lot. I began about us, about our marriage. And I don't think things are going well anymore. Daniel's face didn't change, but I saw his jaw tighten. I continued, the words coming faster now. "We've drifted so far apart. I feel lonely even when you're with me, and I've realized that I find more comfort and connection in Max than I have with you in a long time. This bond is keeping me alive for now, and I want to stay connected to it." Daniel's expression darkened at the mention of Max's name. "A dog," he said, his voice low and controlled. "You're comparing our marriage to your relationship with a dog." He was talking down to me. I was startled by his tone, but I stood my ground. It's not about comparing. It's about realizing what I'm missing. Max gives me unconditional love and care. When was the last time you really saw me, Daniel? When was the last time we really connected? Daniel suddenly stood up and started pacing the room. "So this is about caring. I work hard to take care of us, Eva. I thought you understood that. It's not just about attention," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "It's about emotional intimacy, about feeling valued and loved. I don't feel that with you anymore." The silence that followed was deafening. Daniel was staring out the window with his back to me. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "And do you feel that with Max?" The pain in his voice was very evident, and for a moment I hesitated, but I knew I had to be honest. "Yes," I said softly, "I do." Daniel turned to me, and I saw a mixture of anger and hurt in his eyes. "So what are you saying, Eva? That you want to leave me for a dog?" I shook my head, disappointed. "No, Daniel. I'm saying that my relationship with Max showed me what I was missing in our marriage. It made me realize that I deserved to feel loved and appreciated. We had crossed the line. We had spoken truths that should never have been heard. As the silence stretched on, I felt a strange mixture of sadness and relief. The confrontation I had feared for so long was over, but the aftermath was just beginning. Now, in the silence that followed our brutal honesty, I realized that the hardest part was yet to come. I had to decide what to do next, how to move forward in a world where the foundations on which I had built my life were crumbling. After our confrontation, the house felt different, like I was in prison and on trial. I found myself spending more time in the garden with Max, seeking solace in his unwavering affection. As we sat together on the damp grass, I couldn't help but reflect on the journey that had brought me to this crossroads. How had I gone from a hopeful newlywed to a woman who was willing to abandon her marriage for the love of a dog? Max seemed to sense my turmoil, pressing his warm body against my side and comforting me with gentle licks. In those quiet moments, I felt a clarity I hadn't experienced in years. The bond I shared with Max was more than just friendship. It was a reminder of the emotional connection I crave and deserve in my human relationships. Inside the house, Daniel threw himself into his work with renewed vigor, often not returning until I went to bed. On the rare occasions when we occupied the same space, the tension was palpable. Sometimes I would catch him watching me, his eyes filled with a mixture of confusion and pain that made my heart ache. As the days turned into weeks, I found myself at a crossroads. My life with Daniel felt like a fading dream, while the future stretched before me, uncertain but full of possibilities. I began to imagine what it would be like to start again, to build a life centered around my own needs and desires. One evening on our back porch, watching the sunset with Max's head in my lap, my decision became clear. I realized that staying in a marriage that no longer fulfilled me was unfair not only to me, but also to Daniel. We both deserved a chance to find true happiness, even if it meant parting ways. With trembling hands, I sent an email to a local apartment complex and asked about available apartments. When I hit send, I felt a weight lifted off my shoulders. For the first time in months, I could see a way to put my emotional well-being above societal expectations. That night, as I lay in bed, listening to Daniel's regular breathing beside me, I allowed myself to imagine my new life. Starting over at this stage would not be easy. There would be difficulties, moments of loneliness and doubt, but there would also be freedom, growth, and the opportunity to reinvent myself. As the first rays of the sun touched my face, I couldn't help but wonder, would this new chapter in my life bring the happiness I longed for, or had I made the biggest mistake of my life? The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear: nothing would ever be the same. Max adapted to our new home with his usual enthusiasm. His wagging tail and eager eyes were a constant source of comfort as we navigated this unfamiliar terrain. Our walks in the nearby park became a daily ritual, a time for reflection and healing. The first few weeks were tough, full of practical challenges. Learning to manage my finances on my own, dealing with the legal requirements of separation, and explaining my decision to my bewildered friends and family. Each obstacle tested my resolve, but also reinforced my determination to build a life that truly reflected my needs and desires. The loneliness would creep in on quiet evenings, when the silence in my conditions within IPCENTRRTMENTAL echoed with the VILLAGEGARB has SENCE of another RAISEDPER. In those moments, Max's presence was a balm for my aching heart. His unconditional love reminded me why I had made this choice, even when doubt threatened to suffocate me. As the weeks turned into months, I noticed subtle changes in myself. The woman in the mirror became familiar again, her eyes brighter, her smile more genuine. I rediscovered old hobbies and discovered new interests. Painting classes, book clubs, and volunteering at the local animal shelter filled my calendar and my heart. My relationship with Max deepened in ways I never expected. Without the tension of my failed marriage, I was able to fully appreciate the joy and companionship he brought to my life. Our bond grew stronger, built on mutual trust and affection. Max was not just a pet. He was my confidant, my support system, and a constant reminder of the power of unconditional love. Of course, there were moments of doubt, times when I questioned whether I had made the right choice, but as I watched the sunset from my small balcony, with Max curled up at my feet, I felt a peace that had eluded me for years. The path I chose was not easy, but it was real. Reflecting on my journey, I realized that true love often shows up in unexpected ways. The bravest choice we can make is to follow our heart, even if it leads us down unfamiliar paths. My experiences have taught me that true connection and emotional fulfillment are far more valuable than conforming to societal expectations. But then I got wise, and I went back to Daniel and I apologized profusely because I knew there was no such nonsense with the dog. I hope he forgave me. It's been 2 years now, and Daniel and I have made things right, and at least we are living the same touching and exciting life as before. Thank you for listening to my ridiculous story, beautiful person. I hope you succeed in your life. Don't forget to subscribe and like for more.